Hello class, this is Econ 510 Managerial Economics class. Today is March 31st, Thursday.
The class will move on to chapter 10 of the textbook, which is the oligopoly. So in this chapter, we are going to identify the features that characterize an oligopolistic firm and industry. We outline the 5 forces model and related to oligopoly. We also identify and discuss the behavioral implications of a closed model, the Kuhn model, and the price leadership model. Finally, we are going to use game theory to analyze the strategies available to rivals in a two-person game. Here is the first video clip.
Market that's dominated by a single seller. We called it a monopoly. We've also studied markets that have so many sellers that they each take the price of the product as given. We call that a competitive market. In our last lectures, we looked at another case, a market that has a small number of sellers, but each of them has some market power. That was called monopolistic competition, and it allowed us to study the creation of variety. However, in some ways, monopolistic competition is a special case. What we really are interested in is knowing how a small number of sellers behaves strategically. We're interested in a model in which 3, 4, 5, some small number of sellers makes decisions considering the effect their decision has on other players, where players are considering each other's moves and making strategic decisions, trying to second-guess their rivals as each tries to maximize his or her respective profit. What we're looking for here is a model of what economists call oligopoly. The term oligopoly refers to a market where there is a small number of sellers and where the sellers interact strategically with one another. That is, where each player tries to guess what other players are going to do, because the choices of all the players affect the outcome of the game for each player. That is, my profits depend not only on what I do, but what each of my competitors does as well. There is, in economics, no generally agreed upon single model of oligopoly. There are several different models of oligopoly, each of which has its own strengths and weaknesses. But one thing economists tend to agree upon today is that any description of strategic behavior among a small number of firms is probably best described using what we call game theory. In this lesson, I'll introduce you to game theory, giving you an exposure to the most basic game of all, the prisoner's dilemma. It turns out that the prisoner's dilemma has a lot of applications in economics, and it applies quite well to the behavior among a small number of firms that are considering how to price their products or choosing the quantity of output to produce. So let's introduce the prisoner's dilemma, and I'll introduce it with a story that really doesn't have much to do, at first glance, with economics. Let's suppose we have two prisoners that have been apprehended at the scene of a crime, and we'll call our prisoners Bonnie and Clyde. So let's suppose that Bonnie and Clyde have been apprehended at the scene of a crime, and the district attorney has put them in separate jail cells. And the district attorney comes in and says to Bonnie, "All right, Bonnie, here's the deal. We think that you robbed the bank with Clyde, and we're going to give you two choices. You can either confess to the crime or you cannot confess. If you confess to the crime and Clyde confesses, we will give you both 10 years in jail. Now, if neither one of you confesses, we can't convict you on the bank robbery, but we're going to trump up some charge, and we're going to convict you each for 1 year for loitering. Now, Bonnie, if you confess and Clyde doesn't, we will let you be the state's witness, and you can go free, and Clyde will go to jail for 10 years for the bank robbery and an extra year for perjury, lying to the jury. However, if you don't confess and Clyde does, Clyde gets to be the state's witness, and he goes free, and you go to jail for 11 years. Well, there's the game. Now think about it. Bonnie realizes that her freedom or jail time depends not only on what she does, but also on what Clyde does. That's why we call this a game, because the outcome for each of the players depends upon the joint decision of both players. That is, the outcome depends on what Bonnie does as well as on what Clyde does. Because their fates are linked, we say that we have a game. We have a situation of strategic interaction. Now, in a game, your strategies are the choices that are available to you. And in this case, Bonnie's strategies are she can confess or not confess. And Clyde's strategies are the same. He can either confess or not confess. So the strategies are the choices that are available to each player. Once we know the players and their strategies, we can draw a graph that represents the game. We call this particular graph a matrix. It's an array of numbers, and I will write this matrix out carefully here on the page. The dimensions of the matrix represent the number of players. So Bonnie will be over here, and Clyde will be up here. So when I'm looking at the box from the side, I'm looking at Bonnie's choices. And when I'm looking at the box from the top, I'm looking at Clyde's choices. So Bonnie gets to choose which row of the matrix we wind up on. And the row depends on her choice. Remember, her choices are she can either confess, which I'll represent with a C, or she can not confess, which I'll represent with NC. So Bonnie can either confess or not confess. She chooses the row on which we end up. Clyde chooses the column in which we end up. He can either confess or not confess. Those are his two strategies. And by choosing which one to do, he puts us in the first column or the second column of the matrix. Now, this box represents the outcome where Clyde confesses and Bonnie confesses. This box represents the outcome where Clyde doesn't and Bonnie does confess, and so forth. Each box in the matrix represents an outcome that depends on the choice of Bonnie and the choice of Clyde. Now, we need one more thing to make this diagram complete. We need to represent the outcomes for each player in each of the combinations of strategies. So for instance, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde confesses, each of them goes to jail for 10 years. And here's how I write that. I write Bonnie's 10-year jail term first, and then I put a comma, and I write Clyde's 10-year jail term. So within any box in the matrix, I write the payoffs for the players. The first number represents the payoff for Bonnie, and the second number represents the payoff for Clyde. Now, if neither of them confesses, then they both go to jail for 1 year. So there's Bonnie's 1 year in jail, and here's Clyde's 1 year in jail. However, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde doesn't, Bonnie goes free because she becomes the state's witness, and Clyde goes to jail for 11 years. Same is true if Clyde confesses and Bonnie doesn't, then Clyde becomes the state's witness, and he goes free, and Bonnie goes to jail for 11 years. Well, now I've completely represented the game. This matrix represents everything about the game that we know: the players, their strategies, and the payoffs in each case. Now we're ready to ask the question, how will this game turn out? What's the solution to this game? The solution to a game is the outcome when each player is doing the best they can given what their rivals are doing. We have a name for an outcome like this. We call it an equilibrium. In particular, we call it a Nash equilibrium after the game theorist John Nash, who described it. So a Nash equilibrium is defined as follows. A Nash equilibrium is an outcome of the game where each player is doing the best they can given what all other players are doing. That is, when each player is giving a best response to the other player's best responses, then you have a stable situation. No one wants to change his or her choice. Let's look at how this works. Bonnie's best response to Clyde's decision to confess. If Clyde were to decide to confess, Bonnie's best response would be what? Which outcome is going to minimize Bonnie's jail time? Bonnie minimizes her jail time by confessing anytime Clyde confesses. Suppose now Clyde chooses not to confess. What's Bonnie's best response? Which response would give Bonnie the minimum jail time? The answer is Bonnie would choose to confess. Now notice, whether Clyde confesses or doesn't confess, Bonnie can minimize her jail time by confessing. Bonnie's best response is the same whether Clyde confesses or doesn't confess. She minimizes her jail time with that particular choice. So we call that Bonnie's dominant strategy. In game theory, a dominant strategy is a strategy choice for a player that maximizes that player's satisfaction no matter what the rivals are doing. So no matter what Clyde does, Bonnie minimizes her jail time or maximizes her satisfaction by confessing. Confessing is a dominant strategy for Bonnie. Now, by the same token, we're going to get the same results when we look at Clyde's best responses. If Bonnie confesses, Clyde's best response is going to be to do what? Which of these two columns, which Clyde gets to choose from, which of these two columns gives Clyde the minimum jail time? The answer is Clyde minimizes his jail time by confessing. If Bonnie chooses to put us on the bottom row by remaining quiet, which of these two columns is going to maximize Clyde's satisfaction? Once again, Clyde maximizes his satisfaction by confessing, even if Bonnie doesn't confess. So Clyde wants to confess whether Bonnie confesses or doesn't confess. That is, Clyde has a dominant strategy also, and that is to confess. Now, a Nash equilibrium is a place where Bonnie is giving her best response to Clyde at the same time that Clyde is giving his best response to Bonnie. In a diagram like this, you can see the Nash equilibrium is a box where there are two circles sitting together. That is, if Bonnie is confessing and Clyde is confessing, then nobody wants to switch their decision, given the play of the rival. Bonnie says, well, if Clyde is confessing, I certainly want to confess. Otherwise, I'll be in jail for 11 years. So Bonnie considers but doesn't want to change her choice. Given that Bonnie is confessing, Clyde is certainly happy to confess too, because if he kept quiet, then he would go to jail for 11 years. So given what Bonnie is doing, confessing is Clyde's best response. And since Bonnie is confessing, then she's also giving her best response to Clyde's confession. Neither one of them can improve his or her position by changing their choice. This is a stable outcome, a Nash equilibrium. And it's also what we could call a self-enforcing agreement. That is, once Bonnie and Clyde are both confessing, there is no tendency for either of them to change. There's no temptation for either of them to switch to the other strategy. So the outcome here is self-enforcing. Well, there's one more thing to notice about this. Just because it's an equilibrium doesn't mean that it's a good outcome. It certainly doesn't mean that it's efficient. After all, which combination of choices would minimize jail time for Bonnie and Clyde? The answer is, if Clyde were to be quiet and not confess, and Bonnie were also not to confess, they would wind up in this little box down here, with Bonnie only in jail a year, Clyde only in jail a year, and minimizing the combined jail time of the two players. That would be the best choice because both of them would only have to spend a year in jail. We can put a little star in this box because In an important sense, this is the box that Bonnie and Clyde would prefer to wind up in. This is the one that minimizes jail time. However, even though this is the best box to wind up in, it's not a Nash equilibrium. What's Bonnie going to do if Clyde is committed to not confessing? Well, if Clyde has decided that he's not confessing, Bonnie says, now hold on. If I confess, then I can go free and leave Clyde in jail for 11 years. She may get no satisfaction knowing that Clyde is stuck in jail, but according to these numbers, she's certainly more satisfied having no jail time rather than 1 year. So Bonnie is tempted to change her move and reduce her jail term from 1 year to 0 years. Because of that temptation, Bonnie may defect, and then we are in a different outcome. Once Bonnie is confessing, then Clyde doesn't want to keep his mouth shut. He wants to confess too, and we wind up back at our Nash equilibrium. Even though this box is the best one for Bonnie and Clyde, this box is the self-enforcing agreement. Now, this is a pretty grim view of the way people behave. And in fact, one of the things that happens in business and real life is we spend a lot of time forming relationships with people that we know we can trust, so that whenever we have a situation like this where there's a temptation to cheat, we can be reasonably sure that the other person won't cheat. One of the ways that we enforce cooperative behavior in real life is through repeated play. The fact that Bonnie and Clyde may play this game over and over again every day gives them an opportunity to reward each other for cooperative behavior and to punish each other for opportunistic behavior. That is, if Clyde were to defect and try to stick Bonnie with the 11-year jail term so he could go free, well, Bonnie will get him back next time. So Bonnie and Clyde, if they play often enough and know each other well enough, will be able to enforce cooperation. But in a one-time play, if these numbers tell the whole story, there's only one outcome from rational choice, and that is Bonnie and Clyde both choose to confess. Now, I always feel weird telling people that this outcome is rational, because we all have programmed so deeply into us the good outcome. That is, for many reasons, we are inclined to cooperate and to trust people who we want to believe are trustworthy. On the other hand, it's important to realize that in many cases there are opportunities for defection. So sometimes we need more than just the general trust to keep cooperation enforced. We may need third-party enforcement. Bonnie and Clyde may want to hire a hitman to knock off anybody who thinks. Therefore, the costs are changed for them, and they find that it's individually optimal to keep their mouths shut. We might have third-party enforcement of contracts that make people cooperate. But more likely, people form reputations through repeated play that incline them to be cooperative rather than take advantage of their fellow players by cheating. There are all kinds of prisoner's dilemmas floating around us in the world. Pollution. Am I going to clean up my own mess, or am I going to dump it on other people? There's a good example. It's cheaper for you to dump your stuff in the river, but if everybody does that, we wind up with a bad outcome. Therefore, we have both rules and customs that incline us to clean up our own messes. The prisoner's dilemma, then, creates a problem. The best outcome may not be individually rational, and it may require repeated play, reputations, or contracts to make cooperation more likely. In the next lesson, we'll see how an oligopoly is an example of the prisoner's dilemma. How, if the firms cooperate, they can get the monopoly outcome among them. That is, they can act as a monopolist and split a very big pie among the players. However, once everyone else is holding the price up, you may be tempted to cheat and increase your output so that you can bring in more revenue. But if everybody cheats, then you're once again in a competitive situation with very low profits. So, in the next lesson, we'll develop more clearly the example of the prisoner's dilemma in an oligopoly. We've considered a market that's dominated by a single seller. We called it a monopoly. We've also studied markets that have so many sellers that they each take the price of the product as given. We call that a competitive market. In our last lectures, we looked at another case, A market that has a small number of sellers, but each of them has some market power. That was called monopolistic competition, and it allowed us to study the creation of variety. However, in some ways, monopolistic competition is a special case. What we really are interested in is knowing how a small number of sellers behaves strategically. We're interested in a model in which 3, 4, 5, some small number of sellers makes decisions considering the effect their decision has on other players, where players are considering each other's moves and making strategic decisions, trying to second-guess their rivals as each tries to maximize his or her respective profit. What we're looking for here is a model of what economists call oligopoly. The term oligopoly refers to a market where there is a small number of sellers and where the sellers interact strategically with one another. That is, where each player tries to guess what other players are going to do, because the choices of all the players affect the outcome of the game for each player. That is, my profits depend not only on what I do, but what each of my competitors does as well. There is, in economics, no generally agreed upon single model of oligopoly. There are several different models of oligopoly, each of which has its own strengths and weaknesses. But one thing economists tend to agree upon today is that any description of strategic behavior among a small number of firms is probably best described using what we call game theory. In this lesson, I'll introduce you to game theory, giving you an exposure to the most basic game of all, the prisoner's dilemma. It turns out that the prisoner's dilemma has a lot of applications in economics, and it applies quite well to the behavior among a small number of firms that are considering how to price their products or choosing the quantity of output to produce. So let's introduce the prisoner's dilemma, and I'll introduce it with a story that really doesn't have much to do, at first glance, with economics. Let's suppose we have two prisoners that have been apprehended at the scene of a crime, and we'll call our prisoners Bonnie and Clyde. So let's suppose that Bonnie and Clyde have been apprehended at the scene of a crime, and the district attorney has put them in separate jail cells. And the district attorney comes in and says to Bonnie, "All right, Bonnie, here's the deal. We think that you robbed the bank with Clyde, and we're going to give you two choices. You can either confess to the crime or you can not confess. If you confess to the crime and Clyde confesses, we will give you both 10 years in jail. Now, if neither one of you confesses, we can't convict you on the bank robbery, but we're going to trump up some charge, and we're going to convict you each for 1 year for loitering." Now, Bonnie, if you confess and Clyde doesn't, we will let you be the state's witness, and you can go free, and Clyde will go to jail for 10 years for the bank robbery and an extra year for perjury, lying to the jury. However, if you don't confess and Clyde does, Clyde gets to be the state's witness, and he goes free, and you go to jail for 11 years. Well, there's the game. Now think about it. Bonnie realizes that her freedom or jail time depends not only on what she does, but also on what Clyde does. That's why we call this a game, because the outcome for each of the players depends upon the joint decision of both players. That is, the outcome depends on what Bonnie does as well as on what Clyde does. Because their fates are linked, we say that we have a game. We have a situation of strategic interaction. Now, in a game, your strategies are the choices that are available to you. And in this case, Bonnie's strategies are she can confess or not confess. And Clyde's strategies are the same. He can either confess or not confess. So the strategies are the choices that are available to each player. Once we know the players and their strategies, we can draw a graph that represents the game. We call this particular graph a matrix. It's an array of numbers, and I will write this matrix out carefully here on the page. The dimensions of the matrix represent the number of players. So Bonnie will be over here, and Clyde will be up here. So when I'm looking at the box from the side, I'm looking at Bonnie's choices. And when I'm looking at the box from the top, I'm looking at Clyde's choices. So Bonnie gets to choose which row of the matrix we wind up on. And the row depends on her choice. Remember, her choices are she can either confess, which I'll represent with a C, or she can not confess, which I'll represent with NC. So Bonnie can either confess or not confess. She chooses the row on which we end up. Clyde chooses the column in which we end up. He can either confess or not confess. Those are his two strategies. And by choosing which one to do, he puts us in the first column or the second column of the matrix. Now, this box represents the outcome where Clyde confesses and Bonnie confesses. This box represents the outcome where Clyde doesn't and Bonnie does confess, and so forth. Each box in the matrix represents an outcome that depends on the choice of Bonnie and the choice of Clyde. Now, we need one more thing to make this diagram complete. We need to represent the outcomes for each player in each of the combinations of strategies. So for instance, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde confesses, each of them goes to jail for 10 years. And here's how I write that. I write Bonnie's 10-year jail term first, and then I put a comma, and I write Clyde's 10-year jail term. So within any box in the matrix, I write the payoffs for the players. The first number represents the payoff for Bonnie, and the second number represents the payoff for Clyde. Now, if neither of them confesses, then they both go to jail for 1 year. So there's Bonnie's 1 year in jail, and here's Clyde's 1 year in jail. However, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde doesn't, Bonnie goes free because she becomes the state's witness, and Clyde goes to jail for 11 years. Same is true if Clyde confesses and Bonnie doesn't, then Clyde becomes the state's witness, and he goes free, and Bonnie goes to jail for 11 years. Well, now I've completely represented the game. This matrix represents everything about the game that we know, the players, their strategies, and the payoffs in each case. Now we're ready to ask the question, how will this game turn out? What's the solution to this game? The solution to a game is the outcome when each player is doing the best they can given what their rivals are doing. We have a name for an outcome like this. We call it an equilibrium. In particular, we call it a Nash equilibrium after the game theorist John Nash, who described it. So a Nash equilibrium is defined as follows. A Nash equilibrium is an outcome of the game where each player is doing the best they can given what all other players are doing. That is, when each player is giving a best response to the other player's best responses, then you have a stable situation. No one wants to change his or her choice. Let's look at how this works. Bonnie's best response to Clyde's decision to confess. If Clyde were to decide to confess, Bonnie's best response would be what? Which outcome is going to minimize Bonnie's jail time? Let's apply game theory to the case of a cartel. A cartel is an oligopoly where the individual members try to act as a monopolist. Remember, the monopoly always maximizes profits in a given market. So if we have a number of firms that can get together and act as one, that is, set price and quantity together, they can choose the monopoly price, the monopoly quantity, and earn the monopoly profits, which they can then divide among themselves. A cartel arrangement like this always maximizes profits for the members of the oligopoly. However, holding together a cartel may prove difficult because of the prisoner's dilemma. After all, if your two rivals are showing restraint, that is, they're restricting the quantity that they produce so as to help keep the price high, then you're tempted to try to sell a larger quantity to take advantage of that higher price. It's individually rational for a single firm to take advantage of its rival's restraints by increasing the quantity that it sells. However, if all of the firms, subject to the same temptation, try to increase their output simultaneously, then the price falls back towards the competitive levels. The firms compete, output increases, price falls, and the cartel, for all practical purposes, doesn't exist. The firm sells more output than a monopoly would at a lower price and earns a much smaller profit. What we're going to do in this lesson is show how the cartel's problem is a special case of the prisoner's dilemma. Let's look at two countries that are part of a wannabe cartel. They are Nigeria and Venezuela. These two countries would like to cooperate in the production and sale of oil so that the price of oil stays high and they are able to act as a monopoly jointly and maximize their profits. Then Nigeria and Venezuela each has two strategies. The first is to cooperate with the cartel agreement, in which case you produce your share of the monopoly output. The monopoly output of oil is determined, and Venezuela produces its half, Nigeria produces its half. And in that case, the monopoly profit is produced and shared between the two countries. Alternatively, you can cheat on the agreement. You can let your rival hold the price high by restricting his output, and then you can try to sell a lot of output to take advantage of the high price. This would be called cheating on the cartel agreement, and what it really means is that Venezuela would be producing a larger quantity of oil than the cartel prescribed for it. So instead of restricting itself to 1/2 of the monopoly output, Venezuela might produce 3/4 of the monopoly output, or some larger amount of oil. That then has a bad effect on your rivals who have restricted their quantity, because now you're pushing down the price and you're leaving them in trouble. So let's fill in the table then with the numbers. Let me make an assumption first of all. The assumption is going to be that if both firms cooperate with the cartel arrangement, if the firms act jointly as a monopoly, that they will make a total of $10 million. And that if Venezuela produces half of the output and Nigeria produces half of the output, each of them gets half of that monopoly profit. So if they both cooperate and the cartel is successful, then each of them will get $5 million worth of profit. $5 million for Nigeria, $5 million for Venezuela. Now, notice here that the numbers in the matrix represent profits from oil sales. And since profits are good, each country would like to have as large a number as possible. This contrasts with our previous example, where the numbers represented jail terms, and Bonnie and Clyde both preferred smaller numbers. So if Nigeria and Venezuela are both cooperating with the cartel, they are jointly earning the monopoly profit, $10 million, which they can split between them. Let's suppose now that both of them decide to cheat. If both of them decide to cheat, then both of them increase their output towards the competitive level. If both of them increase their output, then by the law of demand, the price in the market is going to fall for oil. And since we were already maximizing profits under the monopoly arrangement, any increase in output and lowering of prices is going to hurt these two countries as they make a smaller joint profit. This is the best they can do. Any cheating is going to reduce the total size of the pie. So in that case, let's imagine that the total amount of profit earned when both countries increase their output and cheat on the arrangement is only $8 million. And let's suppose that Venezuela gets half of it and Nigeria gets half of it, so that both countries earn $4 million worth of profits on their oil sales. Now, here is the interesting part, the part where we deal with temptation. Let's suppose that Venezuela is cooperating with the agreement and restricting its oil sales so as to help keep the price high. What if, in this case, Nigeria were to cheat? Venezuela is cooperating, but Nigeria increases its oil sales. If that happens, Nigeria takes advantage of Venezuela's restraint and the higher price and sees this as an opportunity to make a lot of money by selling a lot of oil at the higher price. In that case, what happens is Nigeria gets a larger profit, and Venezuela, showing restraint, now dealing with a lower price, sees its own profits fall. So in this case, Nigeria is taking advantage of Venezuela. Venezuela cooperates, Nigeria cheats, and Nigeria increases its profits at Venezuela's expense. Now notice I've been careful that the two numbers add up to 9, a number that's less than the total profit when the firms successfully cooperate, because this is the best outcome you can ever get for these two firms whenever they're able to successfully replicate the monopoly outcome. Let's suppose now that Venezuela cheats on Nigeria. When Nigeria is cooperating, then in that case, Nigeria gets stuck with the low profit, and Venezuela gets the cheater's extra profit. Now we have a matrix that represents the relations here between Nigeria and Venezuela in the market for oil. We have a game here. What's the outcome going to be? Will there be a Nash equilibrium? Well, let's look for the best responses. If Nigeria cheats on the arrangement, then Venezuela's best response is, of course, to cheat also. Otherwise, they'd be making only $3 million instead of $4. That is, Venezuela would wind up being the patsy in this case, taking the fall for Nigeria just so that Nigeria can take advantage of the higher prices to make extra profit. So Venezuela certainly wants to cheat if Nigeria is cheating. If Nigeria is cooperating, Venezuela still has an incentive to cheat. That is, in a one-play game where everything rides on Venezuela's choice in one period, Venezuela can make a higher profit in the short run by cheating than they can by cooperating. So no matter what Nigeria does, Venezuela's best response is to cheat, and therefore cheating is Venezuela's dominant strategy. The same will be true for Nigeria. If Venezuela is cheating, Nigeria would prefer to be on the top row than the bottom, and therefore Nigeria finds it best to cheat. However, if Venezuela is cooperating, Nigeria still prefers to be on the first row because they get a higher profit by cheating on Venezuela, letting them be the sucker in this case. So what we have then is a dominant strategy for Nigeria, and that is to cheat. Well, both of our two producers of oil have a dominant strategy. Venezuela wants to cheat, Nigeria wants to cheat, and in that case, we wind up with a Nash equilibrium where the cartel falls apart. Both of the countries cheat on the arrangement, and therefore the price of oil falls as the quantity increases. Unfortunately, this is the worst point in the table, the point where profits are at a minimum. The best point would be this outcome, where Nigeria and Venezuela successfully hold together a cartel, jointly restricting output and acting as a monopolist. In this case, profit is at a maximum. The problem with this outcome is this: it is not a self-enforcing agreement. If Venezuela is cooperating with the agreement, then Nigeria has an incentive to cheat. If Nigeria is cooperating with the arrangement, then Venezuela has an incentive to cheat. That is, either of them can improve their position by going from 5 to 6 when they defect from the cartel. For that reason, it is not a Nash equilibrium. It is not a self-enforcing agreement, and it is not a stable situation. The stable outcome is this one, with both of them cheating on the arrangement. Now, this doesn't mean that cartels are impossible to hold together. It just means that cartels are more likely under certain circumstances. You'll recall that we discussed the possibility of holding the cooperative arrangement together with repeated play. If Nigeria and Venezuela can punish each other from defecting from the cartel, that means in future periods, if Venezuela has cheated, Nigeria will cheat back, then they'll lose the opportunity to make all of these extra profits. Both of them want to establish a reputation for cooperating so that they can continue over the long run to get the monopoly profit rather than something less. So with repeated play, making decisions every week about how much oil to sell, and monitoring of each other's behavior, Venezuela and Nigeria might arrive at a way to get past the Nash equilibrium, the cheating equilibrium, to something that's better, a cooperative agreement held together by repeated play. In the next lecture, we'll look at another example where the prisoner's dilemma helps to describe the competition and interaction strategically among a small number of players. We'll look at an example of the joint choice of advertising decisions. We've seen that a monopoly faces a downward sloping demand curve, and a perfectly competitive firm has a perfectly elastic demand curve. What does the demand curve look like for a firm that's in an oligopoly? Remember, an oligopoly is a small number of firms watching each other's every move, interacting strategically. Like in the airline industry, what does the demand curve for air travel look like for one particular airline? Consider here we are with airline A, and airline B, C, and D are watching its every move. They're all trying to second guess what each other might do next with respect to the price they charge for their tickets and the quantity of tickets they sell each week. Suppose the initial situation is that airline A is charging a price of $200 a ticket and selling about 10,000 tickets a week. What does the demand curve look like for airline A's tickets? Well, if airline A were to decide to raise its price to try to get more revenue from each customer, probably airline B, C, and D would not follow suit, because if they hang back and keep their prices constant at around $200, they can get a bigger market share as price-sensitive customers defect from airline A and jump to B, C, or D instead. This was the idea that Paul Sweezy had whenever he came up with his kinked demand curve, that if a firm starts with an initial situation and raises its price, they're likely to lose a lot of customers because rival firms will hang back, keep their prices low, and tempt customers away. On the other hand, Sweezy says, if firm A were to decide to lower the price of its airline tickets, probably all of the other firms would follow suit. There would be a big decline in price, and firm A would not add nearly as many customers as it might expect because of retaliation from its rivals. This kinked demand curve is a graph to describe the strategic interaction. When you see a kinked demand curve, it's a way of saying that a firm can expect that rivals will not follow it when it takes its price upwards, but rivals will retaliate and follow suit if it should cut prices. The kink occurs at the point where we begin, the initial situation, the original price and quantity. What does the marginal revenue curve look like for a firm that has a kinked demand curve? Well, the marginal revenue curve, you'll recall, lies below and is steeper than the demand curve, because as you lower your price, you're losing revenue on all of the inframarginal units, the tickets you could have sold at the higher price. So the marginal revenue curve is going to look like this, down to the point of the kink, at which point it immediately changes slope and is going to have a discontinuity and start up again further down the page. This marginal revenue curve tells the change in revenue that this airline can expect if it adds an extra passenger, sells an additional ticket. So if we put the marginal cost curve in here, we're going to be able to predict where firm A is going to choose to operate, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which will usually occur somewhere in this discontinuity. Well, now this is all starting to seem kind of technical, and you might very well ask the question, what determined this original point anyway? What determined the location of this kink in the demand curve? How did we get to this original price and this original quantity? That's a great question, because the model doesn't tell that, and that's one of the criticisms of it. It's really a story about how firms in an oligopoly respond to each other's moves, but it doesn't do an especially effective job at telling us how the kink gets established to begin with, how we arrive at the original situation. It also doesn't tend to match what we actually observe. Empirical data doesn't confirm this theory. The theory, like a lot of theories, is a good story. It's logically consistent. It even has kind of a compelling, sensible element to it. But it's not nearly sophisticated enough to really explain the kind of strategic interaction we get in oligopolies. So we'll have to consider some alternative explanations.
Hello class. So today we're going to start chapter 17, which is about oligopolies. Oligopolies is a different kind of market structure, and so we're going to see how this market structure is. So we're going to look at what kind of outcomes are possible under oligopoly, why is it difficult for oligopoly firms to cooperate, and we're going to see some antitrust laws that fosters competition. So an oligopoly is a market structure where there's only a few sellers in the market that sell very similar or identical products. So instead of a monopoly, which is a one firm basically serving the industry, you have a few firms, like 2, 3, 4, or 5 firms. So in this case, the action of one firm directly affects the actions taken by the other firm. So any price or quantity decisions made by one firm causes another firm to adjust their price and and quantity. And to understand oligopolies better, we use the concept called game theory, which is basically how people or organizations or governments even behave in strategic situations. So here, it's like think about a chess game. Your moves are basically dependent upon how your opponent is playing. So let's look at an example. Let's say there is a cell phone company in a duopoly in small town. A duopoly is basically an oligopoly with just 2 firms. So small town has 140 residents. The product is the cell phone service with anytime minutes and a free phone. And this is the demand schedule. So if the price is 0, then all 140 residents of small town will get a cell phone. However, as we increase prices, the quantity decreases. So when price is 30, the quantity demanded for a cell phone with unlimited minutes is about 80 units. Let's say there are just 2 firms in the market, AT&T and Verizon. A duopoly is basically an oligopoly with 2 firms. Each firm's cost, just to make it simple, they have 0 fixed cost and a marginal cost of $10. So each person, so if they sell 1 extra unit, marginal cost goes up. Marginal cost is $10. Now let's look at this. All right, so this is just filling it up. So if price and quantity, that information is given, so we know the revenue. So revenue is price times quantity, and that's how we get that revenue column. The cost column is basically quantity times the marginal cost, because we don't have any fixed cost. If I sell 140 units and each unit is cost is $10, then 140 units cost $1,400. Now, if we calculate the profit, which is revenues minus total cost, so we find a different cost structure. So basically, if there was just 1 person operating, let's say there was just 1 firm instead of 2 firms, then the monopoly outcome should be $1,800, because that's the one that maximizes profits. So if there was just a monopolist, for example, just AT&T in the market, then the price would be $40, quantity would be 60 units, and the profits would be 1,800 units. But if there was a competitive outcome where price equals marginal cost, then marginal cost is $10, price is $10, so the quantity demanded would be 120 units, and profits earned by the firm would be $0. So now, these are the 2 outcomes we have, either perfect competition or monopoly. So now, if there are 2 firms, what they can do is they could collude together, and they could be like, hey, you know what? Let us divide the market between us so that we can charge monopoly prices and earn monopoly profits together. So this is called a collusion. A collusion is an agreement among firms where they decide how much to produce or what prices to charge. So AT&T and Verizon in this case could agree that, all right, you know what, we could split the small town into east and west small town, or north and south small town. You provide service to north, I'll provide service to south, and we get half the profits of monopoly. So then for each firm, quantity is 30, price is 40, and profit is 900. Now this is what also is known as a cartel, a group of firms who act together. The most famous example of a cartel is OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They basically work together to control world oil prices. So in this case, both firms would actually be better off if they both stick to cartel agreement, because, you know, they are working together. They're like, all right, if the industry itself is acting as if it's a monopoly, so we can just split the profits amongst us, and they would be better off that way. However, the problem is each firm has an incentive to renege on that agreement. Because, as we will see in a little bit, it is very difficult for oligopoly firms to cartel. There is an incentive for firms to renege, and it's kind of hard for them to honor their agreements. So how do we find that out? Because if we look at here, we go back, technically, if both the firms decide, all right, we'll charge $40, okay, and then AT&T says, well, maybe, you know what, if I charge $35 while Verizon is still charging $40, then I could get a lot more customers. Then instead of having, actually, I could even get all the customers. So then instead of earning just 900 profit or sharing 1800 between Verizon and AT&T, I could get all $1,750 as profits, which is much more than 900. So if both firms keep on doing this, then what happens is that they end up coming here. So that's one example. We're going to see a little bit of it in a bit, but let's look at why this happens. It happens because of the concept called Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium, this concept has been actually first figured out by John von Neumann and also Morgenstern, but a very simplified way of explaining it has been actually figured out by Nash, John Nash, who was a mathematician. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. So the equilibrium is named in honor of him. The Beautiful Mind, or A Beautiful Mind, starring Russell Crowe, was actually about John Nash's life. So John Nash, or Nash equilibrium, is a situation where the equilibrium participants, when they interact with each other, they figure out what their best strategy is, no matter what the other person is taking. So if your best strategy is, let's say you are playing chess, if your best strategy is to move bishop, no matter what the other guy does, you will always move bishop, something like that. So in our duopoly example, let's say there is a Nash equilibrium in which each firm produces 30 units. They decided on that we're going to produce 30, as an industry, we're going to have monopoly profits, so each of us should produce 30 units. So given that Verizon produces 30 units, AT&T's best move is to produce 30 units. So given that AT&T produces 30 units, Verizon's best move is to produce 30 units. So in this case, what they're doing is that they might be like, all right, well, if I renege, I will earn much lower profits. So it's best for me to produce 30 units, given that the other person is also producing 30 units. However, when firms in an oligopoly individually choose production to maximize profit, so instead, if they don't collude, if they actually individually chose to provide to maximize profits, oligopoly quantity would be greater than monopoly quantity, but it would be smaller than the competitive quantity. Oligopoly prices would be greater than competitive prices, but less than monopoly prices. Now let's look at the size of the oligopoly. And of course, just like in anything, as the number of firms in the market increases, the price effect becomes smaller, and the oligopoly looks more and more like a competitive market. If you have too many actors, then it's really hard to collude amongst all of them. Because just think about it. If you have a project to finish, if there's just one person doing the project, then it's easy for you to do the work. If there are two people, then it's still easy. You can divide up the work and do it. But if you keep on increasing the number of people working on a project, it gets harder and harder to enforce. So just like in the oligopoly, if there are many firms and they all work together in a collusion, then it's very hard to enforce all the rules. And there's always the incentive to renege and to move and charge a lower price. So the price then approaches marginal cost. And the market quantity then approaches the socially efficient quantity. So another benefit of international trade is, what trade does is that it increases the number of firms competing against each other. So that increases quantity and price gets closer to marginal cost. Before, in the 1980s or 70s, the US was basically dominated by US automobiles. GM, Ford, Chrysler, and all those foreign car companies weren't so much allowed to come in. But once they started to come in, then that started bringing up competition. And at first, the US car companies took a huge blow because they didn't know how to innovate and how to adapt to the market. But eventually, they did. And now we see that, of course, car quality of US cars are much better now, and they are actually much more reliable. So game theory here, which basically is the study of equilibrium, or one of the equilibrium as we talked about, Nash equilibrium, it helps us to understand oligopoly and situations where players interact and behave strategically. A dominant strategy is a strategy that is the best strategy for the player, no matter what the other person chooses to do. And from there, we come up with the concept called prisoner's dilemma. It's a game where if two people play their dominant strategies, they actually get a worse outcome. If there was cooperation, they would have had a better outcome, but when they try to play their dominant strategy, as we will see in an example, they get a worse outcome. So let's look at an example. Let's say the police have caught Bonnie and Clyde, two suspected bank robbers, but they don't have enough information to incriminate either of them for the longest period of time. They just have enough evidence to imprison them for only 1 year. So what the police does, and if you see any kind of police drama, they always interrogate prisoners in two separate rooms. They never interrogate all the prisoners in one room. So the police takes them in each separate room and offers them a deal. If you confess and you implicate your partner, you go free. Okay. If you do not confess, but your partner implicates you, you get 20 years in prison. So if you confess, you get to go, and your partner gets 20 years of jail. But if you don't, if you both confess, though, each gets 8 years in prison, and if neither of you confess, you both get 1 year in prison. So let's look at this. So if Clyde confesses, this is Clyde's decision, that's Bonnie's decision. If Clyde confesses and Bonnie confesses, let's say, then Bonnie gets 8 years. If Bonnie remains silent, then Bonnie gets 20 years and Clyde goes scot-free. If Clyde remains silent, so Clyde doesn't say anything, and Bonnie confesses, then Bonnie goes free. On the other hand, if Bonnie remains silent and Clyde remains silent, then Bonnie gets just 1 year in prison. So the green triangle shows Bonnie's decision. What Clyde does affects Bonnie's outcomes. Now, if Bonnie confesses, then Clyde gets 8 years if Clyde confesses too. If Clyde remains silent, then Clyde gets 20 years. Okay. Similarly, if Bonnie remains silent and Clyde remains silent, Clyde confesses, then Clyde goes scot-free. If Bonnie remains silent and Clyde remains silent, then Clyde gets 1 year and Bonnie gets 1 year too. So in this case, if we look at this situation now, confessing is the dominant strategy of both players. Why? Let's look at this. Supposing we say Clyde confesses. Bonnie doesn't know whether Clyde will confess or not. If Clyde confesses, Bonnie has two options, either remain silent or confess. If Bonnie remains silent, Bonnie gets 20 years. If Bonnie confesses, Bonnie gets 8 years. So it's better for Bonnie to confess, given that Clyde confesses. Okay, now what happens when Clyde remains silent? So let's say Clyde remains silent. Now what should Bonnie do? Well, if Bonnie remains silent, Bonnie gets 1 year. But if Bonnie actually confesses, Bonnie goes free, which is much better than spending 1 year in prison. So if Clyde remains silent, then Bonnie actually goes free. So no matter what Clyde does, if Clyde confesses or remains silent, it's best for Bonnie to confess. So confessing is Bonnie's dominant strategy. Now let's look at what about Bonnie? Let's see if we can remove all these things. Pointer options, erase all link on slide. Now let's look at, so we found out Bonnie's decision is confess. Now let's look at Clyde. What should Clyde do? If Bonnie confesses, okay, Clyde doesn't know if Bonnie's going to confess or not. Then Clyde's also looking at it, and Clyde's like, well, I think it's better for me to confess too if Bonnie confesses, because I just get 8 years instead of spending 20 years in prison. On the other hand, if Bonnie remains silent, then same thing, Clyde is looking at whether should I actually do 1 year or I could actually go scot-free. So Clyde wants to go scot-free, doesn't want to spend 1 year in prison, so Clyde's best decision is to confess. So no matter what Bonnie does, confess or remain silent, Clyde's best decision or dominant strategy is to confess. So if both of them confesses, then this is the outcome they get. Instead of just spending 1 year in prison, since they both confessed, they both get 8 years in prison. So the Nash equilibrium is both of them confess. So in this case, Bonnie and Clyde both confess and they each get 8 years in prison. It would be better off if they both remain silent. And here's the thing, even if they agreed that before, if like one time they might have agreed that, okay, well, if we ever go to prison, we will always remain silent, we won't rat each other out. However, self-interest always takes over and it always will lead them to confess. So oligopolies are similar like that in Prisoner's Dilemma. When oligopolies form a cartel in hopes to achieving a monopoly outcome, they become players like Prisoner's Dilemma. So in our earlier example that we were talking about, AT&T and Verizon are duopolists, and they want to maximize profits, so each firm decides to serve Q equals 30 customers. So here's the payoff matrix that we get. So if both AT&T and Verizon serve 30 customers, their profits are 900. However, if AT&T decides to serve more customers by lowering prices, then AT&T's profits go up to 1,000, Verizon's go down to 750. If same thing, if AT&T keeps at 30 units, but Verizon decides to increase quantity to 40, then Verizon's profits go up to 1,000 and AT&T's profit is 750. And if both of them renege and produce 40 units, then AT&T's profit is 800 and Verizon's profit is 800. From here, of course, we see that, I mean, if Verizon, sorry about that, if Verizon's profit is, if Verizon is producing 30, it's always in the best decision for AT&T to produce 40 units. If Verizon produces 40, then of course AT&T should also produce 40. So the dominant strategy of AT&T is to produce 40 units. And same goes with Verizon. You should try that, do that at home, and see if you can get it. Each firm's dominant strategy is to renege on the agreement and produce quantity at 40 units. So let's look at this one. Let's say there are two players, Delta and United. Their choice is to cut fare by 50% or leave fares alone. If both airlines cut fares, then each airline's profit is the 400 million. If neither airline cut fares, then each airline's profit is 600 million. But if one cuts its fares and the other doesn't, then the profit of the one that did cut its fares goes up to 800 million and the other airline's profit is 200 million. So the next slide will show the answer, but I would like you to actually set up the payoff matrix, find out what's the Nash equilibrium, and then see if your answer matches the one that is in the next slide. Okay? So anyways, that's the answer. So why do people cooperate sometimes? Now, when the game is repeated many times, cooperation may be possible because you could punish the other player. If your rival reneges on one round, you renege in all subsequent rounds. So you're like, if you ever break the contract, I will not work with you ever again. And so in that way, they're both worse off, but that stops the other guy from breaking the contract. Or you could do a tit for tat strategy. If your rival does something in one round and you don't like it, then in the next round you do the same thing until the rival stops doing what they're doing, and you go back to the original equilibrium. Now, oligopolies are not good because they actually are they work as monopolies, and they try to collude and manipulate prices, and that's bad for us consumers. So here we say that governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. In oligopolies, production is too low and prices are too high relative to social optimal. So what policymakers do is they try to promote competition, prevent cooperation, and move oligopoly outcome more towards efficient outcome. So in the early 1900s, there were a few families that controlled some very important industries. So you had the Rockefellers controlling Standard Oil, which basically controlled all the oil production in America. You had J.P. Morgan, who basically controlled the banking industry. You had Vanderbilts, who controlled the railways and all those things. So what happened was President Teddy Roosevelt came up and he broke up those large corporations into smaller firms so that they would compete against each other. And that increased competition, and it prevented firms from charging higher prices. And so consumers were benefiting. So here are some things. Sherman antitrust law, it forbade, of 1890, it did forbid collusion between competitors. So because of that, Coke and Pepsi can't get together and fix prices. Then came the Clayton antitrust laws, which basically strengthened the rights of individuals damaged by anti-competitive arrangement between firms. So if firms are found guilty, then the Clayton Antitrust Act takes actions against those firms.
Just to recap what we said about monopoly, why do people consider the monopolist to be the bad guy? It's because the monopolist charges more money and provides less to the market than a competitive market would. Which people consider this to be bad? Certainly not the monopolist. Consumers view a monopoly as bad. Now, if it were the case that consumers lose $1 and the monopolist gains $1, the government, who's interested in net social welfare, wouldn't care. But the fact of the matter is that for every $1 gained by the monopolist, many dollars are lost by consumers, so the government frowns on monopoly as well. The problem is that not all monopolies are bad. Some types of monopoly are actually more efficient than a competitive market. Remember when we talked about natural monopolies? Natural monopolies occur when the startup costs are so large that effectively the average total cost is always declining. If you produce more, you continue to defray the enormous fixed cost. Remember that in the case of a natural monopoly, it's actually much better to have one producer provide all the units, say 100 units, at a very low cost per unit than to have 10 producers provide only 10 units each at a very high cost per unit. Let's take a closer look at a profit-maximizing natural monopolist, a producer whose cost curves are always declining. Now, add demand and marginal revenue. Where is maximum profit and how much is earned? As always, the output is determined where MR equals MC, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and at that level of output, the price is determined by looking at the demand curve. This monopolist earns everything above its cost per unit, average total cost, up to its price. That's a lot of profit. Now, what happens if the government steps in and tries to make this firm behave more like a competitive industry? In a competitive market, price ends up being equal to marginal cost, and this somehow seems fair to us, because then the price tag is just equal to the additional cost on the last unit produced. What happens if the government decides to subject the natural monopolist to marginal cost pricing? Start with the basic natural monopoly diagram. I'm showing the unregulated decision just for comparison purposes. Where is this producer forced to operate under marginal cost pricing regulation? Remember that the demand line shows the prices, so price equals marginal cost where the demand and marginal cost intersect. Under regulation, the government and consumers are very happy. For example, if this is an electricity producer, then lots of power is being provided at a very low price. Who's not happy with this scenario? The monopolist. Under marginal cost pricing regulation, the monopolist loses the difference between its per unit cost and the price it's allowed to charge on every unit, and that's a lot of units. If you were this producer, what would you do? I know what I would do. Get out at the first opportunity. A marginal cost pricing regulated monopoly will lose money, so it will exit the industry. But then there's no one to produce the product, and we're all left without. Again, imagine the power producer. What do we do with no power being produced? What now? Well, the government is going to have to figure out some way to persuade the monopolist to stay. Now, the government wants to be careful because it wants to cover the firm's losses but not go so far as to give the monopoly positive profits because this would probably anger consumers. There are a few options. 1. Subsidize the monopoly to the tune of average total cost minus the regulated price on each unit to just cover the loss. This might not go over too well with voters because taxpayer dollars are used to pay a monopoly, but effectively what's being done is a redistribution. The wealthier pay more taxes so that everyone, especially the poor, can afford electricity. Option 2. Instead of paying the monopolist, the government could just allow it a slightly higher price such that it can just break even. This would be average cost pricing regulation. It results in a slightly higher price and slightly less output than marginal cost pricing, but does not cause the losses that would result in the monopolist exiting the industry. Option 3. There is a third method that the government could use. Allow the monopolist to price discriminate. Price discrimination means that the producer can charge different prices to different customers for the same product. This would allow the monopolist to get more money from its customers while no one pays more than they're willing to pay for the product. Of course, from the producer's standpoint, perfect price discrimination would be ideal, where each customer pays exactly his or her maximum willingness to pay, but how could this be done? You can't exactly go door to door asking each customer how much he or she would be willing to pay, because those customers don't have any incentive to be truthful with you. In fact, they have every incentive not to be truthful. Instead, producers find ways of capturing blocks of customers. For example, a producer can use peak-off-peak pricing system. When customer demand is highest and most inelastic, you can charge more. When the demand is lowest and most elastic, you charge less. This model is used for electricity, bus fare, movies, etc. It's also possible to price discriminate against the people with the highest opportunity cost of their time by way of coupons and rebates. A very busy person doesn't bother with coupons and often forgets to mail in or follow up on a rebate. Blatant price discrimination is typically illegal, but there are ways to indirectly price discriminate. Next time, oligopoly.
Monopolistic competition may sound like an oxymoron, since the term monopoly might suggest the absence of competition. But remember, in economics, everything exists on a continuum, or a range with two extremes, one at each end. That's just what monopolistic competition is, an industry somewhere on the continuum between a pure monopoly, where a single firm holds all market power, and perfect competition, where many firms exist and each is a perfect substitute for the other. There are 4 conditions that must be met for monopolistic competition to exist. These conditions influence how producers and consumers interact and ultimately determine the behaviors of industry participants. The 4 conditions of a monopolistic competition that must exist. 1. There are many consumers and producers in the market, but no single producer has significantly more control than any other producer. 2. There are differences between the competitors' products, but not price differences. 3. The producers have some control over the price they charge. 4. There are low barriers to enter and exit the market. The first condition may seem counterintuitive. Why would a market defined as monopolistic be required to have many producers? Remember, the term monopolistic refers to the industry. While it isn't a monopoly because there isn't a single firm, it is monopolistic because the many producers that do exist make products that, while not perfect substitutes for one another, are close enough that from the consumer's perspective, they can't go outside the industry to meet their needs. Before we talk about the 4 conditions, it might be helpful to take this first condition and think of an example. What sort of industry do you think meets this first condition? What sort of goods or services can you think of where you might think, I want a blank, and could go to company A, B, or C to get it? Fill in the blank. Hamburger? New pair of shoes? Real estate agent? All are good examples of industries structured as monopolistic competition. Apply the first condition, the requirement for many producers. Doesn't that apply in each of those? How many different places could you get a hamburger, shoes, or a real estate agent? A lot. And while there may be subtle differences, the products are essentially the same. The second condition is that there is more than just price difference between the products. Again, go back to the hamburger example. You could go to one popular national chain and get a hamburger, or go to another and get a hamburger.